What became of Hitler's most trusted military commanders after Germany's defeat? During World War II, German generals held positions of immense power, commanding armies that swept across Europe and pushed deep into the Soviet Union. They were the architects of Blitzkrieg, the masterminds behind some of the most audacious military campaigns in history. However, their authority and prestige ended abruptly with Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945. How did these once powerful military leaders face the consequences of their actions? What happened to the men who had commanded millions of soldiers and shaped the course of the deadliest conflict in human history? In this video, we will explore the dramatic and often tragic fates of German generals after World War II, revealing surprising truths about justice, accountability, and the complex aftermath of total war. When the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, Germany's military leadership found themselves in an unprecedented situation. The men who had once dined with Hitler, planned grand offensives, and controlled vast territories were now fugitives, prisoners, or worse. Some faced immediate consequences. Others managed to evade justice for years. The stories of what happened to these generals reveal not just individual fates, but the broader questions of how a defeated nation and the victorious Allies grappled with the immense crimes of the Nazi regime. Their post-war lives ranged from suicide and imprisonment to surprising leniency and even rehabilitation. Understanding what happened to these men provides crucial insights into post-war justice, the complexities of military command responsibility, and the long shadows cast by World War II. Among the most dramatic endings was that of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox. Born on November 15, 1891, in Heidenheim, Germany, Rommel had earned fame during World War I when he received the prestigious Pour le Mérite Medal for exceptional valor. When World War II erupted, Rommel initially served as commander of Hitler's headquarters guard, developing a close personal relationship with the Führer himself. This proximity to power would prove both beneficial and ultimately fatal. In early 1940, Rommel received command of the 7th Panzer Division and led spectacularly successful campaigns during the invasion of France. His division moved so rapidly and struck so unexpectedly that it earned the nickname the Ghost Division. In February 1941, Hitler dispatched Rommel to North Africa to rescue the faltering Italian forces in Libya. This assignment would transform Rommel into a legend. In the harsh deserts of North Africa, Rommel demonstrated tactical brilliance that earned him respect even from his enemies. His ability to outmaneuver British forces, his daring attacks, and his clever use of deception made him a formidable opponent. British soldiers began calling him the Desert Fox, a nickname that acknowledged his cunning and skill. Hitler, deeply impressed by these accomplishments, promoted Rommel to the rank of Field Marshal in 1942 at the remarkably young age of 50. However, Rommel's successes proved short-lived. At the end of October 1942, his forces suffered a decisive defeat at the Second Battle of El Alamein. The combination of superior Allied resources, improved British tactics under General Bernard Montgomery, and stretched supply lines forced Rommel's Afrika Korps into retreat. By March 1943, Hitler recalled Rommel to Germany, effectively ending his North African campaign. The Desert Fox had been caged. But the Führer still had use for his charismatic field marshal. Rommel's expertise in mobile warfare made him the ideal choice to prepare France's Atlantic coast against the anticipated Allied invasion. In 1944, Rommel worked tirelessly to fortify the beaches along the English Channel. He understood better than most German commanders that the Allies would possess overwhelming material superiority. His experience in North Africa, where Allied air power and logistics had crushed his forces, taught him a crucial lesson. The only way to defeat an Allied invasion would be to destroy it on the beaches before it could establish a secure foothold. Rommel proposed an ambitious defensive strategy, placing armoured reserves immediately behind coastal fortifications so they could counterattack any landing force before it consolidated its position. However, his superiors disagreed with this approach, creating tensions within the German high command that would weaken their response when the invasion finally came. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. Rommel's worst fears materialized as the Allies established their beachhead despite fierce German resistance. For weeks, Rommel struggled to contain the invasion, but the massive disparity in resources made the task impossible. Then, on July 17, 1944, disaster struck. British fighter bombers attacked Rommel's staff car as it travelled along a French road during broad daylight. The attack was devastating. Rommel's driver was killed and the vehicle careened off the road, flipping multiple times before coming to rest. Rommel suffered serious head trauma, a fractured skull, and severe facial injuries. He was rushed to a hospital. His career as a battlefield commander effectively ended by the strafing attack. While Rommel recovered from his injuries, events in Germany took a sinister turn. On July 20, 1944, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb placed in his conference room. The plot failed, and Hitler survived with minor injuries. In the massive investigation that followed, the Gestapo uncovered a wide conspiracy involving numerous military officers and civilians who opposed Hitler's leadership. During these interrogations, Rommel's name emerged. Several conspirators had mentioned the popular field marshal as someone who might support a post-Hitler government. The evidence against Rommel was circumstantial. He likely knew about the conspiracy, but had not actively participated in the assassination attempt. However, this distinction mattered little to Hitler, who felt betrayed by officers he had trusted and promoted. Hitler faced a dilemma with Rommel. The field marshal remained enormously popular with the German public and the armed forces. An open trial would risk turning Rommel into a martyr and potentially revealing the extent of opposition to Hitler within the military ranks. Hitler chose a different, more cynical approach. On October 14, 1944, two German generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen. They presented the wounded field marshal with Hitler's ultimatum. Rommel had two choices. He could face trial before the notorious People's Court, where he would certainly be convicted and executed. His family would face persecution, his reputation would be destroyed, and his property would be confiscated. Alternatively, he could commit suicide. If he chose this option, his death would be attributed to his injuries from the air attack. He would receive a state funeral with full military honours, his family would be left unmolested, and his pension would be preserved. The choice was no choice at all. Rommel understood that the People's Court meant certain death not just for himself, but possibly for his wife and 15-year-old son as well. He made his decision. After bidding farewell to his family, Rommel left with the two generals. A short distance from his home, he took a cyanide pill. Within minutes, the Desert Fox was dead. True to Hitler's word, the regime announced that Field Marshal Rommel had died from complications related to his injuries. On October 18, 1944, Germany held a state funeral for one of its most celebrated commanders. Hitler did not attend, but sent Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt to deliver the eulogy. The truth about Rommel's forced suicide would not emerge until after the war, when his family and close associates finally felt safe enough to reveal what had really happened. Rommel's fate illustrated the precarious position of German generals in the final year of the war. Even the most celebrated commanders could fall victim to Hitler's paranoia and ruthlessness. But Rommel was not the only prominent general to die before Germany's final defeat. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, another highly accomplished commander, met a similarly tragic end just months before Rommel. Born on October 30, 1882, von Kluge came from Prussian military tradition. He served with distinction in World War I and continued his career through the interwar period. When World War II began, von Kluge commanded the Fourth Army during the invasion of Poland, earning recognition for his tactical skill. His success in Poland led to his promotion to Field Marshal and command of the Fourth Army during the invasion of France in 1940. Von Kluge's most significant command came in December 1941 when he replaced Field Marshal Fedor von Bock as commander of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. This assignment placed von Kluge in charge of the primary German force facing Moscow. The timing could not have been worse. The Soviet counteroffensive had just begun, and German forces, unprepared for the brutal Russian winter, faced their first major defeat of the war. Von Kluge managed to stabilize the front and prevent a complete collapse, earning him Hitler's confidence despite the setbacks. However, his tenure in this position proved tumultuous. He frequently clashed with subordinate commanders, particularly the brilliant but difficult Heinz Guderian, whom von Kluge ultimately had removed from command. In October 1943, von Kluge's command of Army Group Center ended abruptly when he suffered serious injuries in a car accident. He spent months recovering, but Hitler had not forgotten his loyal field marshal. In July 1944, shortly after the Allied landings in Normandy, Hitler appointed von Kluge to command German forces in France, replacing Field Marshal Georg von Rundstedt. Von Kluge inherited an impossible situation. Allied forces had established a firm beachhead and were beginning their breakout from Normandy. German forces in France faced overwhelming Allied superiority in numbers, equipment, and especially air power. Von Kluge quickly realized what many other German commanders already knew. Germany could not win the war in the West. The industrial might of the United States, combined with British determination and Soviet pressure in the East, made German defeat inevitable. This realization placed von Kluge in a difficult moral position. Like many German officers, he had taken an oath of personal loyalty to Hitler. However, he increasingly questioned whether continued resistance served any purpose other than prolonging the suffering of the German people. Von Kluge had connections to the resistance movement against Hitler, though his exact level of involvement remains debated by historians. He knew several of the conspirators in the July 20th plot and had apparently indicated some willingness to support a government that would replace Hitler. However, von Kluge did not actively participate in the assassination attempt, and his true feelings about the conspiracy remain unclear. After the failed assassination attempt, von Kluge found himself in a precarious position. The Gestapo was conducting a massive investigation, and several conspirators had mentioned his name under interrogation. Von Kluge's situation in France grew increasingly desperate. Allied forces had broken through German lines and were racing across France. His armies faced encirclement, and he lacked the resources to mount an effective defense. On August 15, 1944, Hitler summoned von Kluge to Berlin for a meeting. Von Kluge understood what this summons meant. Hitler intended to hold him accountable for the military failures in France and possibly implicate him in the July 20th plot. The field marshal would almost certainly face arrest, interrogation, and trial. Von Kluge could not face this prospect. On August 19, 1944, during his journey back to Germany, he stopped his vehicle near Metz, France. He wrote a final letter to Hitler, professing his loyalty and urging the Führer to end the war if it could no longer be won. Then, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge bit down on a cyanide capsule. He was 61 years old. His death removed another experienced commander from Germany's shrinking pool of military leadership. It also revealed the terrible pressure German generals faced in the final phase of the war, caught between their oaths of loyalty, their professional assessment of military reality, and the moral catastrophe their nation had become. Another general who chose death over facing the consequences of defeat was Field Marshal Walter Model. Born on January 24, 1891, Model came from a middle-class background rather than the traditional Prussian aristocracy that dominated the German officer corps. This origin made him unusual among the highest ranks of the Wehrmacht, and perhaps it explained his fervent devotion to Nazi ideology. Model joined the Nazi Party as early as 1925, demonstrating an ideological commitment that endeared him to Hitler. His rise through the ranks accelerated with the outbreak of war. In 1938, he received promotion to Major General and command of the I Army Corps, which participated in the invasion of Poland in 1939. Model's tactical expertise shone on the Eastern Front, where he commanded the 9th Army. He played a key role in planning the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. Although the battle ended in German defeat, Model's defensive skills kept his forces largely intact during the subsequent Soviet offensives. Hitler began to lose faith in the older generation of aristocratic generals, turning instead to committed Nazis like Model. Hitler appreciated Model's middle-class origins and unwavering loyalty to the Nazi cause. The Führer began calling Model his fireman, the commander he could send to any crisis situation to stabilize the front. In March 1944, Hitler promoted Model to Field Marshal in recognition of his service. When Field Marshal Günther von Kluge fell under suspicion after the July 20th plot, Hitler appointed Model as Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front. Model faced the same impossible situation that had overwhelmed von Kluge. Allied forces were advancing rapidly across France, and German forces lacked the strength to stop them. However, Model managed one significant defensive success. In September 1944, Model's forces defeated the British airborne assault at Arnhem during Operation Market Garden. This victory temporarily halted the Allied advance and denied them an early route into Germany. It would be Model's last major success. In December 1944, Hitler launched a desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes, hoping to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. This offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, represented Germany's final major attack of the war. Model commanded Army Group B during this operation. The offensive achieved initial surprise and made significant gains, but it ultimately failed when Allied forces recovered and counterattacked. The Battle of the Bulge exhausted Germany's remaining strategic reserves and accelerated the final Allied advance into Germany. By early 1945, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine River and were driving deep into German territory. Model's Army Group B found itself trapped in the Ruhr region, Germany's industrial heartland. Surrounded and outnumbered with no hope of relief or escape, Model faced the inevitable. On April 15, 1945, Model ordered his troops to surrender. Approximately 300,000 German soldiers laid down their arms, one of the largest mass surrenders in military history. However, Model himself refused to surrender. He could not face the prospect of captivity and interrogation. On April 21, 1945, just days before Germany's final surrender, Field Marshal Walter Model walked into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. His body was not discovered until 1955. Model chose death over accountability, unable or unwilling to answer for his role in Germany's catastrophic war. These dramatic suicides revealed the desperate situation of Germany's military leadership in the war's final months. However, not all German generals chose death. Many survived to face a different fate: capture by Allied forces, interrogation, imprisonment, and for some, trial for war crimes. The question of what to do with captured German generals posed complex challenges for the Allied powers. These men had commanded the armies that devastated Europe. Many had been implicated in war crimes. However, the Allies also needed information from them about German military capabilities, Soviet strength, and the inner workings of the Nazi regime. This tension between justice and pragmatism would shape the post-war treatment of German generals. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch represented one of the older generation of Prussian military officers. Born on October 4, 1881, into a traditional military family, von Brauchitsch followed his forefathers into army service. His career progressed steadily through World War I and the interwar period. In 1938, Hitler appointed von Brauchitsch as commander-in-chief of the German army, making him one of the most powerful military figures in Nazi Germany. Von Brauchitsch held this position during some of Germany's greatest military triumphs. He oversaw the successful Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940, including the invasions of Poland, France, and the Low Countries. These victories established Germany as the dominant military power in Europe and seemed to validate the Wehrmacht's innovative tactics and training. However, von Brauchitsch's tenure as commander-in-chief was increasingly complicated by Hitler's interference in military matters. Hitler, emboldened by early victories, began to micromanage military operations, overruling his generals and insisting on strategic decisions that his professional officers opposed. This interference became particularly pronounced during the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Von Brauchitsch found his authority systematically undermined as Hitler took more direct control of military planning and operations. The relationship between the two men deteriorated as Operation Barbarossa stalled before Moscow. In November 1941, von Brauchitsch suffered a heart attack, his health buckling under the enormous stress of his position. The failure of Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, provided Hitler with the excuse he needed. In December 1941, the Führer dismissed von Brauchitsch from his position and assumed direct command of the army himself. Von Brauchitsch spent the remainder of the war in forced retirement at his estate, effectively sidelined from military affairs. This early departure from active command would have significant implications for his post-war fate. When the war ended in May 1945, British forces arrested von Brauchitsch in August on charges of war crimes. The Allies held him in custody as they prepared to prosecute senior German military and political leaders for their roles in Nazi atrocities. Von Brauchitsch remained in British custody for 3 years, awaiting trial. However, fate intervened before he could face judgment. On October 18, 1948, just as prosecutors prepared his case, Walter von Brauchitsch died of pneumonia in a British military hospital. He was 67 years old. His death before trial raised difficult questions about justice and accountability. The man who had commanded Hitler's armies during their most successful campaigns would never have to answer for his actions in a court of law. His case illustrated a recurring pattern in post-war justice. Many senior German officers, through death, illness, or other circumstances, escaped formal judgment for their wartime roles. The contrast with other captured generals was striking. While von Brauchitsch died before trial, others faced the full weight of Allied justice, or at least what passed for justice in the complex and often contradictory post-war environment. Field Marshal Maximilian von Weichs exemplified another path through the post-war justice system, one marked by both serious charges and controversial outcomes. Born on November 12, 1881, von Weichs had a military career that spanned 2 world wars and brought him to prominence as one of Hitler's senior commanders. During World War II, he commanded the Second Army during major campaigns including the invasions of France, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. His role in these operations placed him at the center of Nazi Germany's war efforts. In 1944, Hitler appointed von Weichs as commander of German forces in the Balkans, a region that had become a cauldron of partisan warfare and brutal repression. His responsibilities in this role included suppressing resistance movements in Yugoslavia and Greece, territories where German forces employed increasingly savage tactics against civilian populations. The anti-partisan operations under von Weichs's command were characterized by mass executions, collective punishment of villages, and widespread atrocities. These actions reflected the desperate measures German forces adopted as their military position deteriorated and partisan resistance intensified. Von Weichs retired from active military service on March 25, 1945, just weeks before Germany's final surrender. When American forces captured von Weichs in May 1945, they initially treated him as a high-value prisoner. The Nuremberg trials, established by the Allies to prosecute major Nazi war criminals, included plans to try senior military commanders for their roles in war crimes and crimes against humanity. Von Weichs found himself scheduled to appear in the hostages trial, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings that focused specifically on atrocities committed in southeastern Europe. The charges against him related directly to the brutal anti-partisan campaigns he had overseen in the Balkans. Prosecutors assembled evidence of massacres, deportations, and systematic violence against civilian populations. The case appeared strong, and von Weichs seemed likely to face severe punishment if convicted. However, in a development that troubled many observers, von Weichs was removed from the trial proceedings before judgment. The official reason given was medical reasons, a vague justification that raised immediate questions about whether powerful individuals were receiving preferential treatment. Von Weichs's removal from the trial allowed him to evade prosecution entirely, despite substantial evidence linking him to serious war crimes. This decision exemplified some of the inconsistencies and controversies that marked post-war justice. While some German commanders faced severe punishment, others escaped accountability through various circumstances. Von Weichs lived for nearly a decade after his removal from trial, dying on September 27, 1954, in Bonn, West Germany, at the age of 72. He had never been held accountable in a court of law for the atrocities committed under his command. The treatment of von Weichs stood in stark contrast to the fate of other field marshals who actually faced trial. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb represented yet another variation in the complex tapestry of post-war justice. Born on September 5, 1876, von Leeb came from Bavarian military tradition and served with distinction in World War I. His service in that conflict earned him several decorations, including the prestigious Military Order of Max Joseph. This honor came with hereditary nobility, transforming his name from simply Wilhelm Lieb to Wilhelm, Ritter von Leeb, marking his elevation to the ranks of the Bavarian nobility. This aristocratic status would define much of his subsequent career and identity. Von Lieb's role in World War II brought him to positions of significant responsibility and corresponding culpability. He commanded Army Group C during the invasion of France in 1940, playing a crucial role in the rapid defeat of French forces. His success in this campaign earned him promotion to Field Marshal, placing him among Germany's military elite. However, it was his subsequent command on the Eastern Front that would bring the most serious allegations against him. On March 30th, 1941, von Leeb attended a meeting with over 200 senior military officers, where Adolf Hitler delivered a speech that would haunt many of those present. Hitler outlined his vision for the coming invasion of the Soviet Union, describing it as an ideological war of annihilation, rather than a conventional military conflict. The Führer made clear that this campaign would not follow the traditional laws of war. Soviet political commissars were to be executed upon capture. Civilian populations would face brutal treatment. The very nature of the conflict demanded, in Hitler's view, exceptional measures. Von Leeb heard these orders directly from Hitler himself. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, von Leeb commanded Army Group North, tasked with advancing through the Baltic states toward the strategic city of Leningrad. The campaign that followed would be marked by enormous casualties on both sides and horrific treatment of Soviet prisoners and civilians. Von Leeb's forces cooperated closely with SS Einsatzgruppen, the special units responsible for mass executions behind the front lines, particularly targeting Jewish populations. While von Leeb himself did not personally participate in these massacres, his forces provided logistical support and security for these operations. He also transmitted the infamous Barbarossa Decree, which authorized the killing of Soviet political commissars and the harsh treatment of prisoners of war. The siege of Leningrad, which von Leeb's forces initiated, would become one of the most horrific episodes of World War II. The city remained under siege for nearly 900 days, resulting in over 1 million civilian deaths, mostly from starvation. Von Leeb commanded Army Group North during the critical first months of this siege, establishing the encirclement that would cause such catastrophic suffering. However, von Leeb's time in command proved relatively brief. By January 1942, frustrated by Hitler's constant interference and the failure to capture Leningrad, von Leeb requested that Hitler either grant him operational autonomy or relieve him of his duties. Hitler chose the latter option. On January 15, 1942, von Leeb was relieved of command, replaced by Georg von Küchler. Hitler never gave von Leeb another command, and he spent the remainder of the war in effective retirement. When Allied forces captured von Leeb after the war, he faced trial in the High Command Trial, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings focused on military leadership. The charges against him were serious, including responsibility for war crimes committed by forces under his command and his role in transmitting and implementing Hitler's criminal orders. Von Leeb's defense team mounted a sophisticated legal strategy. They portrayed their client as a professional soldier who had simply followed orders and fought a military campaign. His attorneys argued that von Leeb had not personally seen or transmitted criminal orders, and that actions by his troops resulted from battlefield necessity rather than criminal intent. They emphasized that von Leeb had been relieved of command relatively early in the war and had not participated in the later, even more brutal phases of the Eastern Front campaign. The court's verdict reflected the complex and often contradictory nature of post-war justice. Von Leeb was convicted of transmitting the Barbarossa Decree and bearing responsibility for its criminal application by units under his command. However, his sentence was surprisingly lenient. He received only 3 years imprisonment, which amounted to time already served. The judgment specifically noted that no criminal order bearing his personal signature or stamp of approval had been introduced into evidence. This technical distinction, while legally significant, troubled many observers who felt it established too high a bar for command responsibility. Von Leeb walked free in 1948, having served no additional time for his role in one of history's most destructive military campaigns. The leniency shown to von Leeb becomes even more striking when one considers the benefits he received from the Nazi regime during the war. Documents revealed after the trial showed that von Leeb had accepted secret gifts from Hitler totaling 250,000 Reichsmarks, along with an estate valued at 660,000 Reichsmarks. These payments indicated a level of complicity with and reward from the Nazi regime that extended beyond simple military service. Yet von Leeb faced no accountability for accepting these bribes or for the systematic atrocities committed by forces under his command. He returned to his estate in Hohenschwangau, Bavaria, and lived there until suffering a fatal heart attack in 1956. He died a free man at the age of 79, his relatively brief imprisonment a small price for his role in history's deadliest conflict. Not all German field marshals received such lenient treatment. The fate of Field Marshal Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist illustrated a much harsher post-war reality for some senior commanders. Born on August 8, 1881, von Kleist came from a family with extensive military tradition stretching back centuries. His career spanned both world wars, but he gained particular recognition for his leadership during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. Of World War II, von Kleist commanded the 1st Panzer Group during the invasion of France in 1940, leading the armoured thrust through the Ardennes that broke through French defences and led to Germany's stunning victory. His bold and aggressive command style perfectly embodied the new mechanised warfare that Germany had pioneered. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, von Kleist again commanded the 1st Panzer Army, this time on the Eastern Front. His forces participated in some of the largest tank battles in history, achieving spectacular initial successes. The encirclements at Uman and Kiev destroyed entire Soviet armies and captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Von Kleist's panzer spearheads drove deep into Soviet territory, coming tantalizingly close to achieving the quick victory that Hitler desired. However, these victories came at enormous cost, and the vast distances, harsh climate, and fierce Soviet resistance gradually eroded German strength. The limits of Blitzkrieg strategy became apparent as logistical challenges, and the brutal Russian winter stalled the German offensive. In 1942, von Kleist received appointment as commander of Army Group A during Germany's summer offensive into the Caucasus. Hitler desperately wanted to capture the region's vital oil fields, which would both fuel Germany's war machine and deny crucial resources to the Soviets. Von Kleist's forces advanced rapidly at first, penetrating deep into the Caucasus and reaching the foothills of the mountains. However, the campaign ultimately failed. German forces became overextended, supply lines stretched to the breaking point, and Soviet resistance intensified. By early 1943, the disaster at Stalingrad forced a general German retreat, and von Kleist's armies had to abandon their gains in the Caucasus. The failure of this campaign marked a crucial turning point. Germany would never again mount a major offensive on the Eastern Front. As the military situation deteriorated through 1943 and early 1944, Hitler grew increasingly distrustful of his field marshals, particularly those from the old Prussian aristocracy. On March 30, 1944, after a series of retreats and failures to halt Soviet advances, Hitler dismissed von Kleist from command. Ferdinand Schörner, a committed Nazi known for his brutal discipline, replaced him. Von Kleist's dismissal might have ended his military career, but it did not end his involvement with the Nazi regime's internal power struggles. Following the failed assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20, 1944, the Gestapo conducted a massive investigation of the conspiracy. They discovered that von Kleist's cousin had been involved in the earlier Oster conspiracy against Hitler. Despite having nothing to do with his cousin's actions, von Kleist found himself arrested by the Gestapo. He spent months in custody, but ultimately the authorities could find no evidence of his personal involvement in any conspiracy. They released him without trial. When the war ended in May 1945, von Kleist was captured by Allied forces. However, his ultimate fate would not be decided by American or British authorities. The Allies handed von Kleist over to Yugoslavia, where he faced trial for war crimes committed by German forces in the Balkans. The Yugoslav court sentenced him to 15 years in prison. However, von Kleist's ordeal was far from over. After serving part of his sentence in Yugoslavia, he was extradited to the Soviet Union. There he faced new charges related to his command on the Eastern Front. The Soviets were far less forgiving than Western authorities when it came to German commanders who had fought on their territory. The Soviet military tribunal showed no mercy. Von Kleist was sentenced to 25 years in a correctional labor camp, one of the harshest punishments meted out to any German field marshal. His final years were spent in Soviet captivity, far from the estates and honors he had known. During his military career, on November 13, 1954, Field Marshal Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist died of heart failure while imprisoned at Vladimir Central Prison, a notorious facility that housed many high-ranking prisoners. He was 73 years old. His death in Soviet custody made him one of the highest-ranking German officers to die as a prisoner of the Soviets. a stark reminder that not all German commanders escaped severe punishment for their wartime roles. Von Kleist's fate stood in marked contrast to many of his contemporaries who faced Western justice. The difference reflected broader patterns in how the victorious powers handled German war criminals. Soviet authorities, having borne the brunt of German atrocities on the Eastern Front, showed far less inclination toward leniency than their Western allies. This disparity created a lottery of sorts for captured German officers. Those who fell into Soviet hands faced harsh treatment and long sentences. Those captured by Western forces often received more lenient treatment, particularly as the Cold War intensified and former enemies became potential allies against communism. Field Marshal Wilhelm List exemplified another path through the post-war justice system, one that combined initial severity with eventual clemency. Born on May 14, 1880, List came from the Bavarian military tradition and served in World War I, before continuing his career through the interwar period. When World War II erupted, List played a key role in the invasion of Poland in September 1939. His success in this campaign caught Hitler's attention and earned him the Führer's favour. By 1940, List had been promoted to Field Marshal, joining the elite ranks of Germany's military leadership. One of List's most notable assignments came in 1941 when he commanded Army Group A during the Balkan Campaign. His forces were crucial in the swift conquest of Yugoslavia and Greece, operations that secured Germany's southern flank before the invasion of the Soviet Union. However, List's involvement in the Balkans connected him to some of the war's darkest chapters. The region experienced brutal repression under German occupation. Partisan resistance provoked savage German reprisals. Mass executions became commonplace. Entire villages were destroyed in retaliation for partisan attacks. While the extent of List's personal knowledge and approval of these atrocities remains debated, his position as commanding officer inevitably linked him to the war crimes committed by forces under his authority. The principle of command responsibility, a cornerstone of military justice, held that commanders bore accountability for crimes committed by their subordinates, particularly when those commanders knew or should have known about the crimes and failed to prevent them or punish the perpetrators. In 1942, List received command of Army Group A during Case Blue, Germany's summer offensive on the Eastern Front. The operation aimed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, resources vital to Germany's continued war effort. List's forces initially made good progress, but they soon encountered severe logistical difficulties and stubborn Soviet resistance. The vast distances involved stretched German supply lines to the breaking point. Soviet forces, having learned harsh lessons from earlier defeats, fought with increasing skill and determination. When the offensive stalled short of its objectives, Hitler's patience with List evaporated. The Führer had grown accustomed to dramatic victories and had little tolerance for commanders who explained why his goals could not be achieved. Hitler dismissed List from command, ending his active military career. List spent the remainder of the war in retirement, watching from the sidelines as Germany's military situation deteriorated. When Allied forces arrested him after the war, he faced trial in the hostages trial. One of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings focused specifically on war crimes committed in southeastern Europe. The prosecution presented evidence of massacres, hostage executions, and collective punishments carried out by German forces in the Balkans under List's command. The case against him appeared strong, bolstered by documented orders and the testimony of survivors. In 1948, the court found List guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment. At age 68, it seemed likely he would die behind bars. However, List's story took an unexpected turn. By the early 1950s, the geopolitical landscape had shifted dramatically. The Cold War had transformed former allies into adversaries and former enemies into potential partners. West Germany was being rearmed as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. In this new context, American authorities began reconsidering the sentences of imprisoned German officers. In 1953, just 5 years into his life sentence, List was released due to ill health. The decision sparked controversy. Critics argued that a man sentenced to life imprisonment for serious war crimes should not be released after serving barely 5 years. Supporters countered that List's advanced age and poor health made continued imprisonment unnecessarily cruel. Whatever the justification, List enjoyed 19 more years of freedom. He lived quietly in West Germany until his death on August 17, 1971, at the impressive age of 91. His case illustrated the changing attitudes toward German war criminals as Cold War priorities increasingly overshadowed justice concerns. Many German officers who received harsh sentences in the immediate post-war period found those sentences dramatically reduced, or commuted entirely as the 1950s progressed. This pattern troubled many who felt that justice for Nazi crimes was being sacrificed for political expediency. Field Marshal Georg von Küchler represented yet another variation in post-war outcomes. Born on May 30, 1881, von Küchler joined the German army in 1900 and gained extensive experience during World War I. He specialized in artillery and continued his military career through the interwar years. During World War II, von Küchler commanded the 18th Army and later Army Group North, playing a significant role in the invasion of the Soviet Union. His forces participated in the Siege of Leningrad, one of the war's most horrific episodes. The siege lasted nearly 900 days and resulted in over 1 million civilian deaths, primarily from starvation. While von Küchler did not initiate the siege strategy, his forces maintained the encirclement that caused such catastrophic suffering. Von Küchler's actions during the war extended beyond conventional military operations. His forces were implicated in numerous war crimes, including cooperation with Einsatzgruppen, death squads, and the murder of mentally disabled individuals in occupied territories. These crimes reflected the ideological nature of the war on the Eastern Front, where Nazi racial theories translated into systematic mass murder. Von Küchler received promotion to Field Marshal in 1942, marking the peak of his military career. However, by early 1944, Soviet forces had broken the siege of Leningrad and were mounting powerful counter-offensives. Von Küchler's Army Group North faced increasing pressure and began a series of retreats. Hitler, frustrated by these setbacks, relieved von Küchler of his command in January 1944. He never received another assignment. When American forces arrested von Küchler after the war, he faced serious charges in the High Command trial. Unlike some of his contemporaries who escaped prosecution through death or medical exemption, von Küchler stood trial and heard detailed evidence of atrocities committed by forces under his command. The proceedings revealed his involvement in crimes including mass murder of Soviet prisoners of war and civilians. During his testimony, von Küchler attempted to mitigate his responsibility. He acknowledged that conditions in prisoner of war camps were harsh, but attributed these conditions primarily to winter weather, which he described as an act of God. He also claimed that the army had exaggerated POW mortality rates to justify receiving additional supplies. These arguments failed to convince the court. The judges found von Küchler guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He received a sentence of 20 years imprisonment, a significant punishment that reflected the severity of the crimes committed under his command. However, like many German officers, von Küchler did not serve his full sentence. In 1951, reviewing authorities reduced his sentence to 12 years. Then, in February 1953, having served less than a decade of even his reduced sentence, von Küchler gained release. He went to live with his wife in the Garmisch region of Bavaria, enjoying 15 more years of freedom before his death in Garmisch-Partenkirchen on May 25, 1968. He was 86 years old. The pattern of harsh initial sentences followed by dramatic reductions and early releases troubled many observers. It suggested that the principles of accountability established at Nuremberg were being quietly abandoned for political reasons. West Germany's strategic importance in the Cold War seemed to outweigh concerns about justice for Nazi crimes. German public opinion, which often viewed imprisoned officers as victims rather than perpetrators, pressured the Allied authorities for clemency. The Adenauer government in West Germany actively lobbied for the release of imprisoned war criminals, arguing that their continued incarceration poisoned relations between West Germany and its NATO allies. Not all German generals faced trial or imprisonment after the war. Some managed to avoid prosecution entirely, while others leveraged their military expertise to find new roles in the post-war world. General Heinz Guderian represented one of the most successful examples of post-war rehabilitation. Born on June 17, 1888, Guderian became one of the most influential military theorists of the 20th century. He was a primary advocate of mechanized warfare and the Blitzkrieg strategy that revolutionized modern combat. His vision of rapidly mobile armoured forces overwhelming enemies through shock and speed proved devastatingly effective in the war's early campaigns. After World War I, Guderian remained in the German army and developed his theories about armoured warfare. He published his influential book, Achtung Panzer, in 1937, which outlined his concepts for mechanized warfare. Adolf Hitler found in Guderian an intellectual ally who shared his vision of military transformation. In autumn 1938, Guderian received appointment as commander of Germany's mobile forces, giving him the opportunity to put his theories into practice. During the Polish campaign of 1939, Guderian's tactics proved spectacularly successful, leading to rapid German victory. In May 1940, he spearheaded an even bolder offensive through France, with his panzer forces driving to the coast and splitting the Allied armies. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, Guderian led his forces to the outskirts of Moscow in October 1941. However, the offensive stalled in the face of Soviet resistance and the brutal Russian winter. Guderian clashed with his superiors over strategy. He argued for tactical withdrawals to defensible positions, while Hitler insisted on standing fast regardless of circumstances. On December 25, 1941, Guderian was removed from his command following his refusal to obey Hitler's stand-fast order and his conflicts with Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had recently taken over Army Group Center. Guderian spent over a year in effective retirement, a period that may have saved his career and possibly his life. In March 1943, Hitler recalled Guderian, appointing him Inspector General of Armoured Forces. This position gave Guderian sweeping powers to prioritize armoured vehicle production and determine their deployment. He used this authority to rebuild Germany's panzer forces after the disasters of 1942. Following the failed assassination attempt of July 20, 1944, Hitler appointed Guderian as acting Chief of Staff of the Wehrmacht. This position placed Guderian at the center of Germany's increasingly desperate military situation. However, his tenure proved brief and contentious. On March 28, 1945, after a failed offensive against Soviet forces at Kustrin, Hitler sent Guderian on indefinite leave. This dismissal likely saved Guderian from having to witness Germany's final collapse or face difficult decisions about surrender. When World War II ended, American forces took Guderian into custody. Despite his prominent role in Germany's war effort and his position in the Nazi military hierarchy, Guderian managed to avoid being declared a war criminal at the Nuremberg trials. The lack of documentary evidence directly linking him to war, crimes or criminal orders worked in his favor. His advocates argued that he had been a professional soldier focused on tactical and operational matters rather than ideological crimes. The court accepted these arguments, and Guderian faced no prosecution. He gained release in 1948, having spent 3 years in custody but facing no criminal conviction. Guderian's post-war career proved remarkably successful considering his prominent role in the Nazi war machine. He wrote his memoirs, Panzer Leader, which became influential in shaping Western understanding of the Eastern Front. He also served as an advisor on military matters, though he never held an official position in West Germany's new armed forces. Guderian lived until 1954, dying of heart failure at age 65. His successful avoidance of prosecution and his post-war rehabilitation as a military theorist, rather than a Nazi commander, illustrated how some German generals managed to separate their professional military reputations from their service to the Nazi regime. Even more striking was the post-war trajectory of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, widely regarded as one of Germany's most brilliant military commanders. Born as Erich von Lewinsky on November 24, 1887, he was adopted by the von Manstein family and took their name. His military career reached its zenith during World War II, when his strategic genius became apparent. At the beginning of the war, von Manstein served as Chief of Staff to General Gerd von Rundstedt during the invasion of Poland. However, his most significant contribution came in planning for the invasion of France. Von Manstein developed an audacious plan to attack through the Ardennes forests with concentrated armoured forces, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line. The German High Command initially rejected von Manstein's plan as too risky. However, the proposal came to Hitler's attention, and the Führer immediately recognized its potential. Hitler adopted the plan, which became the basis for Germany's stunning victory over France in 1940. In June 1940, von Manstein received promotion to general after successfully leading an infantry corps during the campaign. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, von Manstein commanded the 56th Panzer Corps. His forces nearly succeeded in capturing Leningrad, coming tantalizingly close to one of Operation Barbarossa's primary objectives. In September 1941, von Manstein received appointment to command the 11th Army on the Southern Front. This assignment would bring him some of his greatest military triumphs and also implicate him in some of the war's worst atrocities. The 11th Army achieved spectacular successes, including the capture of 430,000 Soviet prisoners in a single battle. Von Manstein's forces withstood aggressive Soviet counteroffensives during the winter of 1941–1942, and then captured the heavily fortified port of Sevastopol in July 1942 after a prolonged siege. This victory earned von Manstein promotion to Field Marshal, recognizing his strategic brilliance and operational success. However, these military achievements came with a terrible price paid by Soviet prisoners and civilians. The 11th Army cooperated closely with Einsatzgruppe D, one of the mobile killing units responsible for massacring Jewish populations in occupied territories. Von Manstein signed orders facilitating the work of these death squads and was aware of their activities. Whether he personally approved of these murders or merely tolerated them as politically necessary remains debated, but his command responsibility for atrocities committed in his operational area cannot be disputed. He issued orders calling for harsh treatment of partisan suspects and collective punishments of civilian populations suspected of supporting resistance. In late 1942 and early 1943, von Manstein orchestrated one of his most daring operations. When the German 6th Army became surrounded at Stalingrad, von Manstein led a relief effort attempting to break through Soviet lines and rescue the trapped forces. His attack came within 30 miles of the encircled army before Soviet resistance and logistical challenges halted the advance. The 6th Army's subsequent destruction marked a turning point in the war, but von Manstein had demonstrated remarkable operational skill even in a losing cause. In February 1943, he achieved one of Germany's most impressive victories by recapturing the city of Kharkov through a brilliant counterattack. This success temporarily stabilized the Eastern Front and showcased von Manstein's tactical genius. However, the overall strategic situation continued to deteriorate. Despite von Manstein's best efforts, Soviet forces gradually pushed German armies back. The failure of Operation Citadel, the massive offensive at Kursk in July 1943, marked the end of Germany's ability to conduct major offensive operations in the east. Von Manstein found himself fighting an increasingly defensive war against an enemy with superior numbers and growing tactical sophistication. His requests for freedom of maneuver and authorization to conduct strategic withdrawals clashed with Hitler's insistence on holding every inch of ground. This fundamental disagreement about strategy poisoned the relationship between Hitler and many of his field commanders, including von Manstein. On March 30, 1944, Hitler dismissed von Manstein from command. The stated reason was military setbacks, but the real cause was Hitler's distrust of his aristocratic generals and their willingness to question his strategic judgment. Von Manstein spent the final year of the war in retirement, watching from the sidelines as Germany collapsed. When British forces arrested him after the war, he faced serious charges of war crimes. Prosecutors assembled evidence of atrocities committed by forces under his command, including cooperation with Einsatzgruppen, harsh treatment of prisoners and civilians, and implementation of criminal orders. Von Manstein's trial, which took place in 1949, attracted significant attention. His defense team, which included prominent British lawyers, argued that he had been a professional soldier simply carrying out military operations. They portrayed the accusations against him as attempts to criminalize legitimate military activities. The prosecution countered with documentary evidence and testimony demonstrating von Manstein's knowledge of and participation in war crimes. After a lengthy trial, the court found von Manstein guilty on multiple charges. However, he was acquitted of the most serious accusations, and his sentence of 18 years imprisonment was considered relatively lenient given the gravity of the crimes. Von Manstein's health deteriorated during his imprisonment, suffering from various ailments that his supporters attributed to harsh prison conditions. In 1953, after serving only 4 years of his sentence, British. Authorities released him for medical reasons. This early release sparked considerable controversy. Critics argued that one of Germany's senior military commanders, convicted of serious war crimes, should not be released after serving such a brief portion of his sentence. Supporters maintained that his age and poor health justified clemency. After his release, von Manstein did not fade into obscurity. Instead, he became an advisor to the new West German government on military matters. His expertise proved valuable as West Germany rebuilt its armed forces, the Bundeswehr, as part of NATO's defense against the Soviet Union. The rehabilitation of von Manstein exemplified a broader pattern in the 1950s. As the Cold War intensified, former enemies became allies. West Germany's military expertise became an asset rather than a liability. German generals who had fought against the Soviet Union found themselves welcomed as advisors on Soviet military capabilities and tactics. This pragmatic approach to former enemies troubled those who felt that justice for Nazi crimes should not be sacrificed for Cold War expediency. Von Manstein published his memoirs, Lost Victories, which presented his version of the Eastern Front campaign and defended his actions during the war. The book became influential in shaping Western understanding of the Eastern Front, though it minimized or ignored the atrocities committed by forces under his command. Von Manstein lived until June 9, 1973, dying at age 85. His long post-war life and his rehabilitation as a military advisor, rather than a convicted war criminal, illustrated the changing attitudes toward German commanders as Cold War priorities overshadowed justice concerns. The contrasting fates of these German generals revealed the complexities and contradictions of post-war justice. Some committed suicide before facing accountability. Others died before trial. Some received harsh sentences in Soviet captivity. Others enjoyed lenient treatment from Western authorities. A few escaped prosecution entirely. These disparate outcomes reflected several factors, including the evidence available, which Allied power held custody, the political climate at the time of trial, and the emerging Cold War dynamics that transformed former enemies into potential allies. The principle of command responsibility, while theoretically straightforward, proved difficult to apply consistently in practice. Prosecutors had to demonstrate that commanders knew or should have known about crimes committed by subordinates, and that they failed to prevent these crimes or punish perpetrators. German commanders developed sophisticated defenses. They claimed they were unaware of atrocities. They argued that harsh measures were militarily necessary. They distinguished between their roles as military commanders and the actions of SS or police units that technically operated independently. These arguments convinced some courts, but not others, contributing to the inconsistent outcomes. The treatment of German generals also reflected changing Western attitudes as the Cold War emerged. In the immediate aftermath of the war, public opinion demanded accountability for Nazi crimes. The Nuremberg trials established important principles about individual responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity. However, as tensions with the Soviet Union escalated, pragmatic considerations increasingly influenced Allied policy toward former German officers. West Germany needed to be rearmed and integrated into Western defense structures. This required rehabilitating not just German society, but also some members of its military establishment. The question of whether justice was served remains contentious. Critics argued that too many German commanders escaped serious punishment for grave crimes. Field marshals who oversaw atrocities received sentences of only a few years and often gained early release. Some were never prosecuted at all. This leniency seemed to contradict the principles established at Nuremberg about accountability for war crimes. Defenders of the system countered that convicting senior commanders posed inherent difficulties. Much documentary evidence had been destroyed. Many potential witnesses had died. The chain of command in the Nazi system was often deliberately obscure. Moreover, the rapid onset of the Cold War created new priorities that made lengthy prosecutions of aging German officers seem less urgent. The rehabilitation of German military expertise proved particularly controversial. By the mid-1950s, former Wehrmacht generals were advising NATO on military strategy and helping to build the Bundeswehr. Men who had commanded armies that devastated Europe now found themselves welcomed as experts on Soviet military capabilities. This transformation troubled many who felt that military competence should not excuse participation in a criminal regime. However, realpolitik prevailed. The Western allies needed German military knowledge, and many Germans needed rehabilitation to integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance. The result was an implicit bargain. Former German officers provided expertise and pledged loyalty to democratic institutions. In return, they received integration into respectable society and the opportunity to rebuild their reputations as professional soldiers rather than Nazi collaborators. The individual stories of these generals also revealed human dimensions often lost in discussions of command responsibility and war crimes. These men were not cartoon villains, but complex individuals who made choices within extraordinary circumstances. Some were ideological Nazis who embraced the regime's criminal goals. Others were traditional military officers who convinced themselves they were simply doing their duty as soldiers. Many fell somewhere in between, compromising with evil while telling themselves they were maintaining professional standards. When the war ended, they faced the consequences of these choices. Some, like Rommel, Kluge and Model, chose suicide over facing judgment. Others, like von Kleist, spent their final years in harsh captivity. Still others, like von Manstein and Guderian, managed to rehabilitate their reputations and find roles in the post-war world. The question of collective guilt also complicated post-war justice. Were all German generals equally culpable for Nazi crimes? Some had commanded forces that committed horrific atrocities. Others had focused on conventional military operations and avoided direct involvement in ideological warfare. Some had profited enormously from the Nazi regime through gifts and bribes. Others maintained a more distant relationship with the political leadership. These distinctions mattered to courts trying to assign individual responsibility. However, they also created opportunities for commanders to minimize their culpability by emphasizing aspects of their service that appeared more honorable or professional. The passage of time gradually changed how these men were remembered. In the immediate post-war years, they were viewed primarily as war criminals and defeated enemies. By the 1950s, as the Cold War intensified, they increasingly appeared as potential allies possessing valuable expertise. By the 1960s and 1970s, as the wartime generation aged and died, they began to enter historical memory. Popular culture, particularly in the West, sometimes portrayed German generals as honorable professionals caught up in an evil system, a characterization that minimized their culpability and agency. This mythologizing troubled historians who emphasized that these commanders had choices and that their decisions facilitated Nazi crimes even when they did not personally pull triggers or operate gas chambers. The documentary evidence that survived the war painted a complex picture. Orders bearing the signatures of field marshals authorized harsh treatment of prisoners and civilians. Reports detailed cooperation between Wehrmacht units and SS death squads. Financial records showed bribes and gifts from the Nazi regime to senior commanders. This evidence contradicted the post-war claims of many generals that they had been unaware of atrocities or had maintained professional distance from Nazi ideology. The archival record demonstrated that the line between military operations and ideological warfare was far more blurred than many generals admitted after the war. They knew far more than they later claimed, and they profited, both materially and professionally, from their service to a criminal regime. Yet even with this evidence, achieving accountability proved challenging. The sheer scale of Nazi crimes, combined with the complexities of military command structures, made it difficult to assign precise responsibility to individual commanders. How much culpability should a field marshal bear for massacres carried out by police units, technically? Outside his chain of command, but operating in his area of operations? What responsibility did commanders have when they transmitted criminal orders from higher headquarters without explicitly endorsing them? These questions generated legal and moral debates that extended far beyond the courtrooms where German generals faced trial. They touched on fundamental issues about the nature of command responsibility, the defense of superior orders, and the relationship between military professionalism and moral duty. The inconsistencies in post-war justice became even more apparent when examining specific cases that revealed the arbitrary nature of outcomes. Consider the case of General Adolf Strauss, who commanded the Ninth Army during Operation Barbarossa. His forces participated in the invasion of the Soviet Union and were implicated in numerous atrocities against Soviet prisoners and civilians. However, Strauss was never prosecuted for war crimes. He lived quietly in West Germany until his death in 1973 at the age of 88. No trial, no imprisonment, no accountability for crimes committed under his command. His escape from justice had nothing to do with innocence, but rather with the accidents of which records survived, which prosecutors had bandwidth to pursue his case, and how the political winds were blowing when decisions about prosecution were made. Similarly, General Gotthard Heinrici, who commanded the 1st Panzer Army and later various other formations on the Eastern Front, never faced prosecution despite his forces' involvement in brutal warfare against Soviet civilians and partisans. Heinrici actually gained some admiration in the West for his defensive tactics during the final Soviet offensive against Berlin. His skill in conducting fighting withdrawals and delaying actions against overwhelming odds made him a subject of interest to Western military analysts studying Soviet tactics. This professional respect helped shield him from accountability. He died in 1971 at age 75, having never faced a courtroom for his wartime actions. The contrast with commanders like von Kleist, who died in Soviet captivity, or even von Manstein, who at least faced trial, highlighted the lottery-like nature of post-war justice. These disparities reflected deeper tensions about what post-war justice aimed to achieve. Was it about punishing individual guilt, about establishing precedents for international law, about satisfying public demands for vengeance, about documenting Nazi crimes for history, about deterring future atrocities? Different Allied powers emphasized different goals, and these priorities sometimes conflicted. The Soviet Union prioritized harsh punishment and viewed leniency as weakness or complicity. The United States initially pursued aggressive prosecution, but gradually shifted toward pragmatic Cold War considerations. Britain balanced legal principles with practical concerns about governing occupied Germany. France faced its own complicated history of collaboration and resistance that influenced its approach to German war criminals. The question of collective versus individual responsibility also generated controversy. Some argued that the entire German military leadership bore collective guilt for serving a criminal regime. This view suggested that senior commanders should face punishment regardless of specific actions because their participation in Hitler's war machine made them complicit in its crimes. Others insisted on individual accountability based on specific actions and documented crimes. This approach meant that some commanders faced severe punishment, while others escaped because evidence against them was insufficient or ambiguous. Both positions had merit, but they led to different conclusions about appropriate punishment. The role of superior orders as a defense created particular difficulties. German commanders frequently argued that they had simply obeyed orders from higher authority, and that military discipline required such obedience. The Nuremberg trials established that superior orders did not absolve individuals of responsibility for war crimes. The tribunals held that there was a moral duty to refuse criminal orders, and that following such orders did not constitute a valid defense. However, applying this principle proved challenging in practice. German military culture emphasized obedience and loyalty. Officers who refused orders faced court-martial and execution. How much moral courage could be reasonably expected from commanders who faced death for disobedience? This question generated endless debate among legal scholars and moral philosophers. Some German generals who survived the war and avoided prosecution became outspoken in defending their actions and those of their fellow officers. They argued that the Wehrmacht had fought honorably and that atrocities were primarily the work of SS and police units rather than regular military forces. This clean Wehrmacht myth gained considerable traction in the 1950s and 1960s, particularly in West Germany, where it served several purposes. It allowed former soldiers to take pride in their military service while distancing themselves from Nazi crimes. It facilitated West German rearmament by suggesting that the new Bundeswehr could build on honorable military traditions. It provided psychological comfort to a society struggling with collective guilt. However, historians gradually dismantled this myth through painstaking research. They documented extensive Wehrmacht involvement in war crimes, including cooperation with death squads, murder of prisoners, starvation of Soviet POWs, harsh treatment of civilians, and participation in anti-partisan operations that amounted to mass murder. The historical record made clear that the Wehrmacht was not a separate professional institution that happened to serve an evil regime, but rather an integral part of the Nazi war machine that facilitated and participated in genocide and other crimes against humanity. Many generals knew about these crimes, enabled them through their commands, profited from them materially, and bore responsibility for them even when they did not personally commit atrocities. The treatment of lower-ranking German officers and soldiers created additional complexities. Hundreds of thousands of German military personnel faced varying degrees of scrutiny after the war. The Allies established programs to denazify German society, which involved screening individuals for their roles in the Nazi regime. However, these programs proved unwieldy and were often inconsistently applied. Some genuine war criminals slipped through the screening process by destroying evidence or lying about their activities. Others who bore minimal guilt faced harsh treatment because they had been members of organizations declared criminal by the Nuremberg trials. The practical challenges of processing millions of individuals inevitably produced injustices in both directions. The Cold War's impact on post-war justice cannot be overstated. As tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union intensified through the late 1940s, priorities shifted dramatically. West Germany transformed from defeated enemy to crucial ally. The Western Allies needed West German cooperation in building a bulwark against Soviet expansion. This strategic imperative influenced decisions about war crimes, prosecutions, and sentences. The Adenauer government in West Germany skillfully leveraged its strategic importance to negotiate for clemency for imprisoned war criminals. By the mid-1950s, most German generals held by Western authorities had been released, including many serving lengthy sentences for serious crimes. The Soviet Union took a different approach. German commanders held in Soviet custody faced harsh treatment and received little benefit from Cold War politics. The Soviets viewed leniency toward German war criminals as morally repugnant given the enormous suffering Germany had inflicted on Soviet territory. Moreover, the Soviet Union had less need to cultivate good relations with West German leaders since East Germany served as their client state. This meant that German generals unlucky enough to fall into Soviet hands faced far worse fates than those captured by Western allies. The disparity was stark and unjust, but it reflected the realities of occupation zones and Cold War politics. One of the most controversial aspects of post-war justice involved the Gehlen Organization, an intelligence network established by the United States using former German military intelligence officers. General Reinhard Gehlen had headed German military intelligence on the Eastern Front during the war. When Germany collapsed, Gehlen surrendered to American forces and offered his services to the United States. He had extensive files on Soviet military capabilities and a network of intelligence contacts in Eastern Europe. The United States, desperately seeking information about Soviet intentions and capabilities, accepted Gehlen's offer. The Gehlen Organization became a key component of Western intelligence operations during the early Cold War, eventually forming the basis for West Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service. This arrangement troubled many observers. Gehlen and his associates had served the Nazi regime. Some had been involved in war crimes or at minimum had knowledge of atrocities committed on the Eastern Front. By employing these individuals, the United States was rehabilitating and protecting potential war criminals in exchange for intelligence. American officials defended the decision as a pragmatic necessity dictated by Cold War imperatives. Critics condemned it as a betrayal of the principles established at Nuremberg. The Gehlen Organization exemplified the broader tension between idealistic commitments to justice and pragmatic Cold War calculations. It also demonstrated how completely Cold War priorities had come to dominate Western policy toward former German military personnel by the early 1950s. The psychological impact on the generals themselves varied considerably. Some showed genuine remorse for their actions. Others remained defiant, insisting they had simply done their duty as soldiers. Many fell somewhere in between, acknowledging that terrible things had happened while insisting they personally bore no responsibility or had been unaware of the worst atrocities. These reactions revealed complex psychological mechanisms through which individuals rationalized their participation in great evil. Cognitive dissonance led many commanders to construct narratives that preserved their self-image as honorable professionals, even as evidence mounted of their complicity in crimes. The memoirs written by German generals after the war became particularly important in shaping historical memory. Guderian's Panzerlieder, von Manstein's Lost Victories, and numerous other accounts provided insider perspectives on German military operations. However, these memoirs also served as sophisticated exercises in self-justification. The authors minimized their awareness of atrocities, emphasized their professional competence, portrayed Hitler as the source of Germany's problems while depicting themselves as voices of military reason, and constructed narratives that separated their honorable military service from the regime's criminal activities. These memoirs influenced generations of military historians and enthusiasts, particularly in the West, where few had access to Soviet archives or perspectives. Western military establishments found value in these memoirs and in maintaining relationships with former German commanders. The Germans had extensive combat experience against Soviet forces, knowledge that NATO desperately needed as it prepared for potential conflict with the Warsaw Pact. German expertise in armoured warfare, defensive tactics, and operations in harsh weather conditions proved particularly valuable. This practical utility reinforced the tendency to separate professional military competence from moral culpability for Nazi crimes. German generals became teachers and advisors, sharing their expertise with former enemies who now sought their knowledge. This rehabilitation normalized their presence in Western military circles and further obscured their participation in criminal activities. The experience of those generals who actually served prison time varied considerably. Some, like Georg von Küchler and Wilhelm List, spent years behind bars before early release. They experienced the humiliation of imprisonment, the loss of freedom and status, and the physical and mental strain of confinement. However, even for these men, imprisonment proved temporary. Early releases, justified on medical or humanitarian grounds, meant that commanders convicted of serious crimes often served only a fraction of their sentences. The pattern was consistent: harsh initial sentences that satisfied demands for justice, followed by reductions and early releases that reflected Cold War priorities and German lobbying efforts. The psychological toll of defeat and disgrace affected different generals in different ways. Those who committed suicide, like Rommel, Kluge, and Model, chose death over facing the consequences of defeat. Their suicides can be interpreted as acts of despair, as final assertions of control, or as attempts to preserve their honor and protect their families. Those who survived to face trial displayed various coping mechanisms. Some remained in denial about the nature of Nazi crimes. Others acknowledged atrocities while claiming ignorance or lack of responsibility. A few showed what appeared to be genuine remorse, though distinguishing sincere regret from strategic positioning for more lenient treatment proved difficult. The families of German generals faced their own challenges. The wives and children of executed or imprisoned commanders dealt with stigma, loss of status, financial difficulties, and the moral burden of association with Nazi crimes. Some families remained loyal and defensive, insisting their husbands and fathers had been honorable men caught in impossible circumstances. Others struggled with the revelation of atrocities committed under their relatives' commands. The children of German generals, like the children of other Nazi officials, faced particular challenges in coming to terms with their heritage. They had to reconcile the fathers they knew personally with the commanders responsible for terrible crimes. The broader German population's attitude toward its former military leadership evolved over time. In the immediate post-war years, many Germans viewed their generals as heroes who had fought bravely for the fatherland. The catastrophic defeat and the revelation of Nazi crimes created cognitive dissonance. Some Germans dealt with this by embracing the clean Wehrmacht myth, which allowed them to honor military service while condemning Nazi political leadership. Others, particularly younger generations, increasingly questioned the honor of serving a criminal regime. By the 1960s and 1970s, West German society was experiencing generational conflicts over memory and responsibility, with younger Germans challenging their parents' generation about its wartime actions. The comparison between German generals and their Japanese counterparts revealed interesting parallels and differences in post-war justice. Like German commanders, many Japanese generals faced war crimes trials. Some were executed, others imprisoned. However, the United States proved even more willing to rehabilitate former Japanese military leaders for Cold War purposes, particularly as communist victory in China and the Korean War made Japan a crucial Asian ally. The pattern of initial harsh justice followed by Cold War pragmatism appeared in both theatres, suggesting that geopolitical considerations ultimately trumped accountability concerns in both cases. The experience of those German generals who managed to avoid prosecution entirely raised troubling questions. How had they escaped accountability when others faced trial? In many cases, the answer involved a combination of luck, destroyed evidence, and prosecutors' limited resources. The sheer number of potential defendants meant that prosecutors had to prioritize cases. They focused on the most senior leaders and those for whom documentary evidence was strongest. Commanders who had served in less prominent positions or whose records had been destroyed often escaped scrutiny. This arbitrary element in determining who faced trial and who did not troubled advocates of consistent justice. Some generals actively worked to destroy evidence of their crimes. As Germany collapsed in early 1945, many commanders ordered the burning of documents that might incriminate them. These efforts proved partially successful. Much documentary evidence was indeed destroyed, making prosecution more difficult. However, the systematic nature of Nazi bureaucracy meant that copies of many orders and reports survived in various archives. The Allies also captured extensive files when they occupied German territory. While many individual commanders succeeded in destroying evidence of their specific actions, the overall documentary record of Wehrmacht crimes remained substantial and damning. The role of German generals in shaping post-war narratives about the Eastern Front proved particularly significant. In the West, understanding of the war against the Soviet Union came largely from German sources. Soviet archives remained closed to Western researchers during the Cold War. This meant that German commanders' accounts, with all their biases and self-serving distortions, became the primary sources for Western historians studying the Eastern Front. These accounts emphasized German tactical brilliance and Soviet numerical superiority, while minimizing German atrocities and Soviet tactical innovation. The result was a distorted picture that portrayed the Wehrmacht as a professional force, fighting honorably against overwhelming odds, a characterization that obscured the reality of genocidal warfare. Several German generals became military consultants and advisors to Western governments and NATO during the 1950s. Their expertise in armored warfare, defensive operations, and combat against Soviet forces made them valuable resources. This consulting work provided income and status, while also helping to rehabilitate their reputations. However, it also meant that men who had served a criminal regime and participated in or enabled war crimes were now being paid by democratic governments to share their expertise. The moral compromise involved in these arrangements troubled some observers, but seemed unavoidable given Cold War imperatives and the need for military knowledge about Soviet capabilities. The treatment of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt illustrated another dimension of post-war justice. Born on December 12, 1875, von Rundstedt was one of the oldest and most senior German commanders. He held multiple important commands during the war, including positions on both the Eastern and Western fronts. Von Rundstedt's aristocratic background and traditional military bearing made him a symbol of the old Prussian officer corps. When Allied forces captured him after the war, he faced potential prosecution for war crimes committed by forces under his command. However, von Rundstedt's advanced age and poor health complicated the decision about whether to try him. British authorities held von Rundstedt in custody while they deliberated about his fate. He suffered from heart problems and other ailments that raised questions about whether he was physically capable of standing trial. In 1949, British authorities released him without trial, citing his medical condition. Von Rundstedt spent his final years living quietly in West Germany, dying on February 24, 1953, at the age of 77. His release without trial disappointed those who felt that senior commanders should face accountability, regardless of age or health. However, pragmatists argued that prosecuting an elderly, infirm man who might die before trial served little purpose. Von Rundstedt's case exemplified how medical considerations influenced decisions about prosecution, sometimes allowing commanders to escape accountability. The question of whether German generals should have been executed for their crimes generated intense debate. The Nuremberg trials executed several top Nazi leaders, including military figures like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, who held positions in the high command. However, most field commanders who faced trial received prison sentences rather than death penalties. This distinction reflected several considerations. The Allies wanted to demonstrate that military command alone did not warrant execution. They reserved capital punishment for those who held the highest authority or who were directly implicated in the most heinous crimes. This approach attempted to balance justice with mercy, while establishing legal precedents about command responsibility. Critics argued that this leniency was misplaced. They pointed out that German generals had commanded armies that killed millions and devastated entire countries. Many had signed orders authorizing atrocities or had created conditions that enabled genocide. From this perspective, prison sentences of a few years seemed absurdly inadequate punishment for such crimes. However, defenders of the sentences argued that indefinite imprisonment or execution of all senior commanders would have been impossible to implement and might have created martyrs. They also noted that the legal challenges of proving individual culpability for specific crimes made capital punishment difficult to justify in many cases. The contrast between Nazi political leaders and military commanders in terms of punishment revealed interesting patterns. Top political leaders like Göring, von Ribbentrop, and others were executed or sentenced to long prison terms. Military commanders generally received more lenient treatment. This disparity suggested that the Allies viewed political leaders as bearing greater responsibility for Nazi crimes than professional soldiers, even when those soldiers implemented criminal policies. This distinction reflected a desire to separate political responsibility from military duty. But it also potentially undermined accountability by suggesting that following orders could excuse participation in atrocities. Some German generals who survived the war and avoided prosecution later expressed regret about their service to the Nazi regime. General Hans Speidel, who had served as Rommel's chief of staff, became a prominent advocate for democracy and European integration. He served as the first German commander of NATO ground forces in Central Europe, symbolizing West Germany's reintegration into the Western Alliance. Speidel's post-war career illustrated how former German officers could reinvent themselves as democratic, pro-Western figures. However, even Speidel's rehabilitation raised questions. Had his views genuinely changed, or had he simply adapted to post-war realities? How much accountability should be required before former Nazi officers could assume positions of trust and authority? The experience of General Johannes Blaskowitz provided a particularly tragic example of a German commander caught between conflicting loyalties. Blaskowitz commanded armies in Poland, France, and later the Western Front. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Blaskowitz protested against SS atrocities in Poland, submitting reports to his superiors detailing the murders being committed behind German lines. These protests earned him Hitler's lasting enmity and effectively ended his prospects for advancement. When the war ended, Blaskowitz was captured by American forces. He was scheduled to testify at the Nuremberg trials about Wehrmacht-SS relations and Nazi crimes. However, on February 5, 1948, before he could testify, Blaskowitz died under mysterious circumstances, falling from a window at the Nuremberg detention center. The official verdict was suicide, but questions persisted about whether Blaskowitz had indeed taken his own life or whether he had been murdered to prevent his testimony. His death deprived prosecutors of a potentially valuable witness who could have provided insider perspective on Wehrmacht knowledge of and response to Nazi atrocities. It also illustrated the precarious position of German officers who had opposed aspects of Nazi policy. Even if they avoided prosecution, they faced suspicion from former comrades who viewed them as traitors and from allies who questioned their motives. Blaskowitz's protests against atrocities had not saved the victims, had damaged his career, and ultimately had not protected him from becoming another casualty of the war's aftermath. The role of medical evaluations in determining fitness for trial became increasingly important, as many German generals were elderly men by the time they faced potential prosecution. Doctors examined these commanders and provided assessments of whether they were physically and mentally capable of participating in legal proceedings. These evaluations sometimes became controversial when healthy-looking commanders received medical exemptions that seemed suspiciously convenient. Critics suspected that some doctors provided favorable evaluations for sympathetic or ideological reasons, or that defendants exaggerated their ailments to avoid trial. However, proving that a medical evaluation was fraudulent proved difficult, and Allied authorities generally accepted doctors' determinations about fitness for trial. The impact of post-war justice on German military culture proved significant. The prosecution of senior commanders, even when inconsistent and sometimes lenient, established the principle that military leaders could be held accountable for crimes committed by their forces. This precedent influenced the development of the Bundeswehr, West Germany's new armed forces established in the 1950s. The Bundeswehr emphasized education about democratic values, civilian control of the military, and the right and duty of soldiers to refuse illegal orders. These innovations represented lessons learned from the Wehrmacht's participation in Nazi crimes and reflected West Germany's attempt to build military forces that would never again serve a criminal regime. However, the Bundeswehr's relationship with Wehrmacht traditions remained complicated. Many of the officers who built the new German military had served in the Wehrmacht. They brought their professional expertise but also their baggage of service to the Nazi regime. The Bundeswehr struggled to establish traditions that honored military professionalism while clearly rejecting the Nazi period. This tension persisted for decades, with periodic controversies over which military traditions were appropriate to honor and how to acknowledge the Wehrmacht's role in Nazi crimes while still taking pride in German military heritage. The treatment of German generals also influenced broader debates about transitional justice and how societies deal with mass atrocities. The Nuremberg trials established important legal precedents about crimes against humanity, aggressive war, and individual responsibility. However, the inconsistent prosecution of German commanders and the Cold War-driven clemency that followed raised questions about whether these principles were being taken seriously. Later efforts to address mass atrocities in Cambodia, the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and other locations wrestled with similar challenges about how to balance justice, reconciliation, and practical political considerations. The financial consequences of defeat affected German generals differently depending on their circumstances. Some lost estates and property confiscated by occupying authorities or in territories that became part of Poland or the Soviet Union. Others retained property in what became West Germany and eventually regained some measure of financial security. The pensions and benefits that had been promised to high-ranking officers as part of their compensation became contentious issues. West German governments eventually restored military pensions to many former Wehrmacht officers, including some who had been convicted of war crimes. This restoration of benefits troubled many who felt that war criminals should not receive state pensions, but German authorities justified it as honoring military service, while separating that service from criminal acts. The international dimension of post-war justice added additional complications. Different countries that had suffered under German occupation had different priorities and different approaches to prosecuting German war criminals. Yugoslavia, as we saw with von Kleist and List, aggressively pursued commanders whose forces had committed atrocities in the Balkans. The Soviet Union prosecuted Germans for crimes on the Eastern Front. Other countries had their own war crimes proceedings. This multiplicity of jurisdictions created situations where commanders might face prosecution in multiple countries for the same or related crimes. It also meant that some commanders who escaped prosecution in one jurisdiction might face charges elsewhere, creating uncertainty about their legal jeopardy that could persist for years. The declassification of documents in subsequent decades continued to reveal new information about German generals and their actions during the war. Archives opened in the 1970s, 1980s, and especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 provided historians with access to previously unavailable records. These documents often contradicted the self-serving accounts that German commanders had provided in their memoirs. They revealed the extent of Wehrmacht cooperation with SS death squads, documented commanders' knowledge of atrocities, and showed the systematic nature of crimes committed by German forces. This documentary evidence vindicated those who had insisted on Wehrmacht culpability and challenged the clean Wehrmacht myth that had gained currency in earlier decades. The long-term legacy of how German generals were treated after World War II continues to shape discussions about military justice and accountability. The principles established at Nuremberg regarding command responsibility and the illegitimacy of the superior order's defense have influenced military law worldwide. Modern military forces incorporate training about the laws of war and emphasize that soldiers have both a right and duty to refuse illegal orders. These developments directly trace back to the legal precedents established when prosecuting German commanders. However, the inconsistent application of these principles and the Cold War clemency that followed raise questions about whether the international community was truly committed to accountability or whether justice would always be subordinated to political expediency. The question of whether enough was done to hold German generals accountable admits no easy answer. On one hand, many senior commanders faced trial, conviction, and imprisonment. The Nuremberg trials established groundbreaking legal principles. The world witnessed unprecedented attempts to hold military leaders accountable for their actions during wartime. On the other hand, the inconsistent prosecutions, lenient sentences, early releases, and rehabilitation of former Nazi officers suggested that justice was incomplete and compromised. Too many commanders escaped accountability entirely. Too many received sentences that seemed inadequate for the gravity of their crimes. Too many found comfortable post-war lives despite their service to a genocidal regime. The personal stories of individual generals revealed the human dimensions of these larger questions. Consider the case of General Gottlob Berger, who commanded various SS and Wehrmacht units and was deeply involved in recruiting and organizing foreign volunteers for the Waffen-SS. Berger faced trial at Nuremberg and received a 25-year sentence. However, he served only 6 years before gaining release in 1951. He then worked in business and died peacefully in 1975 at age 75. His relatively brief imprisonment for serious crimes exemplified the pattern of harsh initial sentences followed by Cold War clemency. Did 6 years constitute adequate punishment for his role in the Nazi war machine? Most observers would say no, yet his release reflected the political realities of the 1950s. The fate of General Otto, Wöhler illustrated another variation in post-war outcomes. Wöhler commanded various formations on the Eastern Front and was implicated in anti-partisan operations that involved mass killings of civilians. He faced trial in the High Command case and received an 8-year sentence. However, he served only 4 years before his release in 1951. Wöhler then lived quietly until his death in 1987, at the age of 96. He outlived most of his contemporaries and died peacefully in his sleep, having spent far more years free after his conviction than he spent imprisoned. His case raised uncomfortable questions about the proportionality of punishment and whether justice had been truly served. The involvement of German generals in post-war West German politics added another dimension to their rehabilitation. Some former commanders, like General Hans Speidel, became prominent political figures and advocates for European integration and transatlantic cooperation. Their presence in public life signaled West Germany's transformation from enemy to ally. However, it also meant that men who had served Hitler were now helping to shape democratic institutions. This paradox reflected West Germany's complicated relationship with its past. The nation needed experienced leaders to rebuild, yet those leaders often had problematic histories. The compromise was to accept former officers who demonstrated commitment to democracy while maintaining vigilance against those who remained committed to Nazi ideology. The treatment of German military records and archives became important for historical understanding. The Allies captured enormous quantities of German military documents, which they used for war crimes prosecutions and later made available to historians. These records provided invaluable insights into German military operations, decision-making, and crimes. However, German generals also had opportunities to shape how these records were interpreted. The US Army's Historical Division employed former German generals to write accounts of their campaigns. These accounts, while providing valuable operational details, also reflected the biases and self-interest of their authors. They emphasized German military professionalism while minimizing cooperation with Nazi ideology and participation in atrocities. The question of collective memory and how societies remember their military leaders proved particularly complex for Germany. Other nations that fought in World War II could celebrate their veterans as heroes who defeated fascism. Germany faced the challenge of acknowledging military service while confronting the reality that this service had been to a criminal regime. West Germany struggled with this tension, sometimes honoring military professionalism, while avoiding uncomfortable questions about complicity in Nazi crimes. East Germany took a different approach, emphasizing anti-fascist resistance and portraying the Wehrmacht as a tool of capitalist imperialism. Neither approach fully grappled with the moral complexities of military service under Hitler. The international precedents established by prosecuting German generals influenced subsequent war crimes tribunals. The International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and the International Criminal Court all built on principles established at Nuremberg. Command responsibility, crimes against humanity, and the rejection of superior orders as defenses became cornerstones of international humanitarian law. However, these later tribunals also faced challenges similar to those that complicated German prosecutions: difficulty proving individual culpability, political considerations that influenced prosecutions, and debates about the appropriate severity of punishment. The Nuremberg legacy proved both inspiring and cautionary. The personal writings of German generals, including diaries, letters, and memoirs, provided complex portraits of men grappling with their wartime experiences. Some writings showed genuine reflection about moral choices and regret about actions taken or not taken. Others revealed continuing commitment to Nazi ideology or resentment about Germany's defeat. Many showed the human tendency to rationalize and justify one's actions while minimizing personal responsibility for negative outcomes. These documents remain valuable for historians studying not just military operations, but also the psychology of individuals who participated in great evil, while often viewing themselves as professionals simply doing their duty. The impact on military education worldwide was profound. Military academies and staff colleges began incorporating more extensive training about the laws of war, ethical decision-making, and historical case studies, including Wehrmacht crimes. The goal was to ensure that future military leaders understood their legal and moral obligations and would not repeat the failures of German commanders who enabled or participated in atrocities. This educational emphasis represented a positive legacy from the otherwise troubling post-war treatment of German generals. If future officers learned from these historical examples, perhaps the principles established at Nuremberg could prevent future atrocities even if justice for past crimes remained incomplete. The deaths of the last surviving German generals in the 1980s and 1990s brought an end to the generation that had commanded Hitler's armies. As these men died, they took their personal memories and perspectives with them. What remained was the historical record, comprising official documents, trial transcripts, memoirs, and the scholarship that has continued to examine their lives and actions. This historical reckoning has been generally more harsh and more honest than the legal reckoning of the immediate post-war years. Historians have documented the extent of Wehrmacht crimes, demonstrated command, responsibility, and challenged the myths that German generals constructed about their service. While legal justice was incomplete, historical judgment has been more thorough. The question of whether former enemies can become allies without compromising justice remained central to the German experience. The rapid transformation of West Germany from defeated enemy to NATO ally required some degree of amnesia, or at least strategic forgetting about the recent past. German rearmament would have been impossible if all compromised officers had been excluded from military service. The need for experienced leadership and the desire to integrate Germany into Western defense structures meant accepting some former Wehrmacht officers into the new Bundeswehr. This pragmatic decision facilitated Cold War strategy, but also meant that the principle of accountability for war crimes was subordinated to geopolitical considerations. The contrast between the fates of enlisted soldiers and senior commanders revealed class dimensions in post-war justice. Ordinary soldiers who committed atrocities sometimes faced harsh punishment, while generals who ordered or enabled those same atrocities received relatively lenient treatment. This disparity reflected broader patterns in how justice systems often treat elite defendants differently than ordinary ones. It also raised questions about whether the Nuremberg principles of command responsibility were being consistently applied, or whether rank and status still provided advantages even in a system supposedly dedicated to impartial justice. The role of public opinion in shaping outcomes for German generals proved significant. In the immediate post-war period, public opinion in Allied countries strongly supported harsh treatment of Nazi war criminals. However, as the Cold War intensified and memories of the war faded, public pressure for prosecution diminished. German public opinion, meanwhile, generally sympathized with imprisoned commanders, viewing them as patriots who had served their country even if they had served a criminal government. This sympathy influenced West German political leaders to lobby for clemency. The interplay between public opinion, political calculations, and justice principles demonstrated how accountability efforts can be undermined when public support wanes. The generational shifts in understanding and memory became increasingly important as time passed. Germans who had lived through the war had personal memories that shaped their views of the military leadership. Some remembered generals as heroes, others remembered them as instruments of oppression. Younger generations born after the war approached the question differently. Without personal memories of the war, they could examine evidence more dispassionately, but also lacked the context that shaped their parents' views. These generational differences influenced how German society remembered and evaluated its former military. Leaders with younger generations often more willing to acknowledge Wehrmacht crimes and criticize the compromises made in the name of Cold War expediency. The declassification of Soviet archives after 1991 provided new perspectives on German generals, particularly their actions on the Eastern Front. Soviet documents corroborated and extended Western evidence of Wehrmacht crimes. They also revealed the harsh treatment German commanders received in Soviet custody, treatment that contrasted sharply with the relatively lenient Western approach. The opening of these archives vindicated historians who had argued for Wehrmacht culpability and challenged those who had accepted German commanders' self-serving accounts at face value. The new evidence demonstrated once again that justice for German war criminals had been incomplete and that many commanders had escaped accountability for serious crimes. The question of whether time limits should apply to prosecuting war crimes gained relevance as decades passed after the war. Some argued that at some point society needed to move forward and that elderly men should not face prosecution for crimes committed decades earlier. Others insisted that no statute of limitations should apply to crimes against humanity and that survivors deserved justice regardless of how much time had passed. This debate influenced decisions about whether to pursue prosecutions of former Nazi officials and guards discovered alive in the 1980s, 1990s, and even later. The principle that war crimes should face prosecution regardless of time elapsed represented an important legacy of the Nuremberg trials, even though implementation remained inconsistent. The impact on German national identity proved profound and long-lasting. A nation that had taken pride in military prowess now had to confront the reality that its military had served a criminal regime and participated in genocide. This reckoning shaped German political culture, making the country wary of military power and deeply committed to international law and human rights. The negative example of Wehrmacht crimes influenced Germany to become one of the most pacific developed nations, deeply skeptical of military intervention and committed to multilateral approaches to international security. In this sense, the crimes of German generals and the incomplete justice that followed had an unintended positive consequence. They helped shape a Germany that rejected its militaristic past. The personal redemption or lack thereof among German generals who survived the war varied considerably. Some appeared to experience genuine moral reckoning and expressed regret for their actions. Others remained unrepentant until death, maintaining that they had simply done their duty as soldiers. Many fell somewhere in between, acknowledging that terrible things had happened while insisting they personally bore no responsibility. These varied responses reflected different personalities, different degrees of involvement in crimes, and different capacities for moral reflection. They also demonstrated how difficult it can be to achieve genuine accountability when perpetrators can construct narratives that preserve their self-image as honorable professionals. The lessons learned or not learned from the treatment of German generals after World War II remain relevant today. The tension between justice and reconciliation, between accountability and pragmatism, between legal principles and political reality, continues to shape how the international community responds to mass atrocities. The Nuremberg trials established important precedents, but the subsequent compromises and clemency demonstrated how easily those principles could be eroded when other priorities intervened. Understanding this history helps inform contemporary debates about transitional justice and how societies should deal with perpetrators of mass atrocities. In the final analysis, the fate of German generals after World War II revealed both the possibilities and limitations of international justice. Unprecedented efforts were made to hold military leaders accountable for their crimes. Important legal principles were established. Many commanders faced trial and punishment. However, political considerations consistently undermined pure justice. Too many escaped accountability, too many received lenient treatment, too many found comfortable post-war lives. The Cold War transformed former enemies into allies, a transformation that required downplaying or ignoring past crimes. The result was a complicated legacy, groundbreaking legal principles established but inconsistently applied, justice attempted but compromised, accountability pursued but incomplete. The stories of these generals, from those who chose suicide over facing consequences to those who lived long lives after brief imprisonments, collectively illustrate the complexities of holding individuals accountable for participation in state-sponsored evil. They show how ordinary men can become complicit in extraordinary crimes, how professional military culture can facilitate rather than prevent atrocities, and how difficult it proves to achieve meaningful justice in the aftermath of total war. These lessons remain relevant as the world continues to grapple with conflicts, atrocities, and questions about accountability. The role of documentation in post-war justice cannot be overstated. The German military's meticulous record-keeping, a hallmark of bureaucratic efficiency, ironically provided much of the evidence used to prosecute commanders for war crimes. Orders signed by field marshals, reports detailing atrocities, and correspondence revealing knowledge of criminal activities all survived in various archives. This documentary evidence proved crucial in establishing command responsibility and demonstrating that senior commanders knew about and enabled crimes. However, the massive destruction of records in the war's final months also created gaps in the documentary record that some commanders exploited to claim ignorance of atrocities committed by forces under their command. The testimony of survivors and witnesses played a vital role in prosecutions, but also presented challenges. Witnesses could describe atrocities they experienced or observed, providing powerful human testimony about the consequences of military decisions. However, connecting specific crimes to specific commanders often proved difficult. The chain of command in wartime is complex, with multiple levels of authority and sometimes overlapping or unclear responsibilities. Witnesses might not know which commanders had authorized particular actions or whether local commanders had acted on their own initiative. These evidentiary challenges meant that even when atrocities were well documented, proving the culpability of specific generals could be legally complicated. The psychological profiles of German generals varied considerably, and these differences influenced their post-war experiences. Some commanders were ideological Nazis who genuinely believed in Hitler's vision and willingly implemented criminal policies. Others were traditional military professionals who viewed themselves as apolitical servants of the state, though this self-perception often obscured their complicity in Nazi crimes. Some were opportunists who advanced their careers by aligning with Nazi ideology without necessarily sharing its core beliefs. These psychological and ideological differences affected how commanders behaved during the war, how they defended themselves afterward, and how much genuine remorse, if any, they expressed for their actions. The concept of moral injury, now recognized as a significant psychological consequence of participation in atrocities, helps explain some generals' post-war struggles. Moral injury occurs when individuals violate their own deeply held moral beliefs through their actions or failure to act. Some German commanders who participated in or enabled atrocities may have experienced moral injury even if they did not acknowledge it explicitly. The high rate of suicide among senior commanders, both before and immediately after Germany's defeat, suggests that at least some grappled with profound psychological distress related to their actions. However, distinguishing moral injury from simple fear of consequences or loss of status remains difficult in individual cases. The question of military honor and its relationship to service under a criminal regime generated intense debate. Traditional military culture emphasized honor, duty, and loyalty as core values. German generals had been trained in this culture and had built their identities around these military virtues. The revelation that they had served an evil regime and participated in criminal activities challenged the foundation of this identity. Some commanders dealt with this cognitive dissonance by insisting they had maintained personal honor despite serving Hitler. They argued that honor lay in military professionalism, courage under fire, and care for their troops rather than in the political cause they served. Critics countered that no honor could exist in service to genocide, and that military professionalism that enabled mass murder was itself dishonorable. The treatment of German generals by different Allied powers revealed interesting patterns about national attitudes toward justice and pragmatism. The Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of German atrocities, showed the least mercy. Soviet military tribunals delivered harsh sentences, and conditions in Soviet prison camps were severe. The United States initially pursued aggressive prosecution but proved most willing to grant clemency as Cold War considerations intensified. Britain balanced legal principles with practical concerns about governing occupied Germany and maintaining Allied unity. France, with its own complicated history of collaboration and resistance, approached German war crimes with particular sensitivity to questions about complicity and accountability. The impact of Cold War espionage and intelligence gathering on the treatment of German generals added another morally complex dimension. Beyond the Gehlen organization, various German commanders provided intelligence to Western powers about Soviet military capabilities, deployments, and tactics. This intelligence proved valuable as tensions escalated between East and West. However, it meant that war criminals or potential war criminals received protection and sometimes payment in exchange for information. The prioritization of intelligence value over accountability troubled many observers but reflected the harsh realities of Cold War competition. The Soviets engaged in similar practices, recruiting German officers who provided intelligence about Western military developments. The relationship between German generals and the German people evolved in complex ways after the war. Initially, many Germans viewed their military leaders with a mixture of respect for their service and bitterness about the catastrophic defeat. As information about Nazi atrocities became more widely known, some Germans became more critical of military leaders who had enabled these crimes. However, the clean Wehrmacht myth, which separated honorable military service from Nazi political leadership, gained traction in the 1950s. This myth allowed Germans to honor their veterans and fallen soldiers, while condemning the Nazi regime. The myth persisted for decades before historians thoroughly documented Wehrmacht complicity in war crimes, forcing a more honest reckoning with the military's role in Nazi atrocities. The economic dimension of Germany's post-war recovery influenced attitudes toward former military leaders. West Germany needed experienced managers, engineers, and administrators to rebuild its economy. Many former Wehrmacht officers found positions in business and industry where their organizational skills and leadership experience proved valuable. This economic integration facilitated social rehabilitation and helped former commanders re-establish normal lives after release from imprisonment. However, it also meant that men who had commanded armies that devastated Europe were now prospering in the post-war economic boom, an outcome that troubled those who felt they should face permanent social and economic consequences for their wartime roles. The role of churches and religious organizations in providing support or accountability for former German generals revealed another dimension of post-war dynamics. Some religious leaders offered pastoral care and spiritual counseling to imprisoned commanders, helping them cope with confinement and loss of status. Others took more critical stances, insisting that genuine repentance required acknowledging moral culpability for war crimes. The Catholic Church, with its presence in both German and Allied countries, played a particularly complex role, sometimes facilitating escape routes for war criminals while also providing moral witness against Nazi atrocities. Protestant churches in Germany struggled with their own complicity in failing to effectively oppose Nazi policies, which complicated their moral authority to hold military leaders accountable. The question of whether German generals could have refused to participate in criminal activities without facing severe consequences remains contested. Some commanders claimed they had no choice but to obey orders, that refusal would have meant court-martial and execution. Historical research has challenged this claim, demonstrating that very few Wehrmacht officers faced severe punishment for refusing to participate in atrocities. Some generals requested transfers when confronted with orders to commit crimes, and these requests were generally granted without serious consequences. This evidence suggests that commanders had more moral agency than many claimed after the war. Their participation in crimes reflected choices, not inevitable necessity, though the pressure to conform and obey certainly made those choices difficult. The treatment of German generals contrasted interestingly with how other Axis military leaders were handled. Japanese generals faced war crimes trials, with some executed and others imprisoned. However, the United States proved even more willing to rehabilitate Japanese military leaders than German ones, particularly as China fell to communism and Japan became the key US ally in Asia. Italian generals generally faced less severe accountability than their German counterparts, partly because Italy had switched sides in 1943, and partly because Italian forces, while involved in atrocities particularly in North Africa and the Balkans, were not implicated in genocide to the same extent as German forces. These comparative perspectives revealed how geopolitical considerations and the specific nature of crimes influenced post-war justice. The development of international humanitarian law in the decades after World War II, built directly on the Nuremberg precedents established through prosecuting German generals. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 codified many principles about the treatment of prisoners of war and civilians in wartime. Additional protocols in the 1970s further developed these rules. The Rome Statute, creating the International Criminal Court in 1998, established a permanent institution for prosecuting war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. All of these developments trace their origins to the legal innovations of the Nuremberg trials. While the treatment of German generals revealed the difficulties of achieving consistent justice, the legal principles established during their prosecution influenced international law for generations. The memorialization of World War II in Germany reflected the complicated legacy of German military leaders. Unlike countries that fought against Nazi Germany, which could build monuments honoring their veterans as heroes, Germany faced the challenge of remembering those who served while acknowledging that their service had been to a criminal regime. West Germany avoided glorifying military service and focused instead on victims of Nazism and the importance of peace and reconciliation. East Germany emphasized anti-fascist resistance and portrayed Wehrmacht soldiers as victims of capitalist imperialism. After reunification, Germany continued to struggle with how to remember the military aspects of the war while maintaining moral clarity about Nazi crimes. The personal correspondence of German generals, including letters to family members and colleagues, provided insights into their private thoughts and feelings about their wartime experiences and post-war fates. Some letters revealed genuine anguish about decisions made during the war. Others showed mainly self-pity and resentment about defeat and imprisonment. Many demonstrated the human capacity for self-justification and rationalization, with commanders explaining their actions in ways that minimized their culpability. These private documents complemented official records and trial testimony, providing a more complete picture of how these men understood their own roles in history's deadliest conflict. The impact of post-war trials on military doctrine worldwide proved significant. Armed forces around the world studied the Nuremberg principles and incorporated them into training about the laws of war. The emphasis on individual responsibility, even for those acting under orders, influenced how militaries approached questions of moral and legal obligations. The principle that manifestly illegal orders should be refused became standard doctrine in many professional militaries. These developments represented positive legacies of the Nuremberg trials, even though the treatment of individual German generals often fell short of the principles those trials established. The role of media coverage in shaping public perceptions of German generals after the war cannot be overlooked. The Nuremberg trials received extensive press coverage, exposing global audiences to evidence of Nazi crimes and the principles of accountability being established. However, as the trials moved from major Nazi leaders to military commanders, media attention decreased. The subsequent clemency and early releases received far less coverage, meaning that many people retained their initial impressions from Nuremberg without understanding how thoroughly those principles had been compromised by Cold War politics. This pattern of intense initial coverage, followed by diminished attention to later developments, shaped public understanding and memory. The question of whether the children and families of German generals should have faced any consequences for their relatives' crimes raised difficult ethical questions. Allied occupation authorities initially took a broad approach to denazification, which could affect family members of Nazi officials. However, targeting children for their parents' crimes violated principles of individual responsibility that the Allies claimed to uphold. Most family members of German generals faced social stigma and loss of property or status, rather than legal punishment. This approach attempted to balance justice with fairness, though it meant that families who had benefited materially from their relatives' service to the Nazi regime sometimes retained those benefits. The evolution of academic historiography about German generals reflected broader trends in understanding World War II and the Holocaust. Early post-war scholarship, often relying heavily on German commanders' own accounts, sometimes accepted their self-serving narratives at face value. By the 1970s and 1980s, historians began more critically examining Wehrmacht crimes and command responsibility. The opening of Soviet archives in the 1990s accelerated this revisionist scholarship, providing new evidence of Wehrmacht atrocities. Contemporary historical scholarship presents a far more damning picture of German military leadership than prevailed in the decades immediately after the war, revealing how thoroughly these commanders were implicated in Nazi crimes. The legacy of how German generals were treated after World War II continues to influence debates about military justice and accountability in the 21st century. When political and military leaders in other countries face accusations of war crimes or crimes against humanity, the Nuremberg precedents are invoked as models for accountability. However, critics point to the inconsistent application of those principles and the Cold War compromises as cautionary examples of how political considerations can undermine justice. The tension between legal principles and practical politics that characterize the treatment of German generals remains relevant in contemporary debates about international justice and reconciliation after mass atrocities. Well, that's it. The fate of German generals after World War II remains one of history's most complex chapters about justice, accountability, and the aftermath of catastrophic conflict. From those who died by their own hand to those who lived decades as free men after brief imprisonments, these commanders' post-war lives reflected the contradictions of trying to achieve justice while navigating political realities. The principles established at Nuremberg represented humanity's noblest aspirations for accountability, yet their inconsistent application revealed how easily those aspirations could be compromised. These men commanded the armies that devastated Europe and participated in crimes of unprecedented scale. Their treatment after the war shaped international law and influenced how subsequent generations would grapple with similar questions. Understanding their fates helps us comprehend both the possibilities and limitations of justice in the wake of mass atrocities. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video, What Happened to Germany's Top Field Marshals After World War II. It provides additional insights into the fates of Germany's highest-ranking military leaders and the complex justice that followed. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one!